Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you are here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll finish our reading of Mob Rule in New Orleans, the Robert Charles story. Tonight, we'll be highlighting lynchings that happened in other parts of the South, as well as some of the statistics from those lynchings in the years 1892 through 1891.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Burning human beings alive. Not only has life been taken by mobs in the past 20 years, but the ordinary procedure of hanging and shooting have been improved upon during the last 10 years. 15 human beings have been burned to death in the different parts of the country by mobs. Men, women, and children have all gone to see the sight, and all have approved of the barbarous deeds done in the highlight of the civilization and Christianity of this country. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks for tuning in. In 1891, Ed Coy was burned to death in Texarkana, Arkansas. He was charged with assaulting a white woman, which is the greatest crime that a Black person can commit, is to assault a white woman. And after the mob had securely tied him to a tree, the men and boys amused themselves for some time by sticking knives into Coy's body and slicing off pieces of flesh. When they had amused themselves sufficiently, they poured coal oil over him, and the women, in this case, set fire to him. It is said that 15,000 people stood by and saw him burned. This was on a Sunday night, and press reports told how the people looked on while the Negro burned to death. So as you can see, they include their women and their children in this. This is not just mobs of men. February 1st, 1893. Henry Smith was burned to death in Paris, Texas. The entire county joined in that exhibition. The district attorney himself went for the prisoner and turned him over to the mob. He was placed on a float and drawn by 4 white horses through the principal streets of the city because they wanted everyone to see what was going on. Men, women, and children stood at their doors and waved their handkerchiefs and cheered the echoes. They knew that the man who was to be burned to death because the newspaper had declared for 3 days previous that this would be so. Excursions were run by all the railroads, and the mayor of the town gave the children a holiday so that they might see the sight. So that all the apparatuses of the state came together to watch this black man be lynched. Henry Smith was charged with having assaulted and murdered a little white girl. He was an imbecile. And while he had killed the child, there was no proof that he had criminally assaulted her. He was tied to a stake on a platform which had been built 10 feet high so that everybody might see the sight. The father and brother and uncle of the little white girl had been murdered was up on the platform about 50 minutes entertaining the crowd of 10,000 persons by burning the victim's flesh with red hot irons. So before they lynched him, they were poking him basically with those prods. Their own newspapers told how they burned his eyes out and ran the red hot iron down his throat, cooking his tongue, and how the crowd cheered in wild delight. At last, having declared themselves satisfied, coal oil was poured over him and he was burned to death, and the mob fought over the ashes for bones and pieces of his clothes because they wanted to commemorate this event. On July 7, 1893, in Bardwell, Kentucky, C.J. Miller was burned to ashes. Since his death, this man has been found to be absolutely innocent of the murder of 2 white girls with which he was charged. But the mob would wait for no justification. They insisted that, as they were not sure he was the right man, they would compromise the matter by hanging him instead of burning. Not to be outdone, they took the body down and made a huge bonfire out of it. So even though they said that they weren't going to burn his body, they wound up using it to make a bonfire because they didn't want to be outdone. July 22nd, 1893, at Memphis, Tennessee, the body of Lee Walker was dragged through the street and burned before the courthouse. Walker had frightened some girls in a wagon along a country road by asking them to let him ride in their wagon. They cried out. Some men working in a field nearby said it was an attempt of assault, and of course began to look for their prey. There was never any charge of rape. The women only declared that he attempted an assault. After he was apprehended and put in jail and perfectly helpless, the mob dragged him out, shot him, cut him, beat him with sticks, built a fire, and burned the legs off. Then took the trunk of the body down and dragged it further up the street, and at last burned it before the courthouse. He was asking for a ride. He was asking for a ride. Don't ask white people for nothing. Greetings, KW Don 7. How are you tonight? September 20th, 1893, at Roanoke, Virginia. The body of a Negro who had quarreled with a white woman was burned in the presence of several thousand persons. These people also wreaked their vengeance upon this helpless victim of the mob's wrath by sticking knives into him, kicking him, and beating him with stones and otherwise mutilating him before his life was extinct. June 11th, 1898, at Knoxville, Arkansas. James Perry was shut up in a cabin because he had smallpox and burned to death. He had been quarantined in this cabin when it was declared that he had this disease and the doctor sent for. When the physician arrived, he found only a few smoldering embers. Upon inquiry, some railroad hands who were working nearby revealed the fact that they fastened the door of the cabin and set it to fire and the cabin and burned the man and the cabin and hut together. They burned him to death because he was sick with smallpox. February 22nd, 1898, at Lake City, South Carolina. Postmaster Baker and his infant child were burned to death by a mob that had set fire to his house. Mr. Baker's crime was that he had refused to give up the post office to which he had been appointed by the national government. The mob had tried to drive him away by persecution and intimidation. Finding that all else had failed, they went to his home in the dead of night and set fire to his house. And as the family rushed forth, they were greeted by a volley of bullets. The father and his baby were shot through the open door and wounded so badly that they fell back in the fire and were burned to death. The remainder of the family, consisting of the wife and 5 children, escaped with their lives from the burning house, but all of them were shot. One of the number was made a cripple for life. The man wouldn't give up his job, and they lynched him. They burned him, they shot him, they killed him and his infant daughter because he wouldn't give up his job. On January 7th, 1898, 2 Indians were tied to a tree at Maud Post Office, Indian Territory, and burned to death by a white mob. They were charged with murdering a white woman. There was no proof of their guilt except for the unsupported word of the mob. Yet they were tied to a tree and slowly roasted to death. Their names were Louis Magessie and Hans Martin. Since that time, the boys have been found to be absolutely innocent of the charge. Of course, that discovery is too late to be of any benefit to them. But because they were Indians, the Indian Commissioner demanded and received from the United States government an indemnity of $13,000. They make us pay to kill our children. Remember that. These cops and police officers and mobs make us pay to kill our children. Why do you say that, matron? I say that because a cop gets overzealous and shoots someone in a traffic stop, and then the cop gets accused and is charged with a crime. He's made to pay a fine. Sometimes they have insurances and they can personally bankrupt the cop, but oftentimes they lobby the lawsuit against the department, and the department has to pay, and the department gets its funds from the public. So they make us pay as they kill our children. April 23rd of 1899, at Palmetto, Georgia, Sam Hose was burned alive in the presence of a throng on Sunday afternoon. He was charged with killing a man named Cranford, his employer, which he admitted because his employer was about to shoot him. To the fact of killing the employer was added an absolutely false charge that Hose assaulted his wife. Hose was arrested and no trial was given him. According to the code of reasoning of the mob, none was needed. A white man had been killed and a white woman was said to have been assaulted. That was enough. When Hose was found, he had to die. The Atlanta Constitution, in speaking of the murder of Cranford, said that the Negro who was suspected would be burned alive. Not only this, but it offered a $500 reward for his capture. After he had been apprehended, it was publicly announced that he would be burned alive. Excursion trains were run and bulletins were put up in the small towns. The governor of Georgia was in Atlanta while excursion trains were being made up to take visitors to the burning. Many fair ladies drove out in their own carriages on Sunday afternoon to witness the torture and burning of a human being. Hose's ears were cut off, then his toes and fingers, and passed around to the crowd. His eyes were put out, his tongue was torn out, and flesh cut in strips by knives. Finally, they poured coal oil on him and burned him to death. They dragged his half-consumed trunk out of the flames, cut it open, extracted his heart and liver, and sold slices for 10 cents each for souvenirs, all of which was published most promptly in the daily papers of Georgia and boasted over by the people of that section. So these people are savages. Never forget that. They drug his trunk, the trunk of his body, out of the flames, cut it open, and then they began to slice up his internal organs and sell them. October 19th, 1889, in Canton, Mississippi, Joseph LaFleur was burned to death. A house had been entered and its occupants murdered during the absence of the husband and father. When the discovery was made, it was immediately supposed that the crime was the work of a Negro and that the motive of that assaulting white women. Bloodhounds were procured and they made a round of the village and discovered only one colored man absent from his home. This was taken to be proof sufficient enough that he was the perpetrator of the deed. When he returned home, he was apprehended, taken into the yard of the house that had been burned down, tied to a stake, and then was slowly roasted to death. Can you imagine the agony of being slow roasted to death? You smell your own flesh cooking. You hear your skin crackling, unable to stop it. And this is what they call a Christian nation. These highly civilized people are doing these acts and actions with no repercussions. December 6, 1899, at Maysville, Kentucky, William Coleman was also burned to death. He was slowly roasted, first one foot and then the other, and then dragged out of the fire so that the torture might be prolonged. All of this without a shadow of proof or scintilla of evidence that the man had committed the crime. Thus have the mobs of this country taken the lives of their victims within the past 10 years. In every single instance, except one of these burnings, these burnings were witnessed by from 2,000 to 15,000 people. And no one person in all these crowds throughout the country had the courage to raise his voice and speak out against the awful barbarism of burning human beings to death. Men and women of America, are you so proud of this record which the Anglo-Saxon race has made for itself? Your silence seems to say that you are. Your silence encourages a continuance of this sort of horror. Only by earnest, active, united endeavor to arouse public sentiment can we hope to put a stop to these demonstrations of American barbarism. Lynching record. The following table of lynchings has been kept year by year by the Chicago Tribune, beginning with 1882, and shows a listing of Negroes that have been lynched during that time. In 1882, 52 Negroes were murdered by mobs. In 1883, 39 Negroes were murdered by mobs. In 1884, 53 Negroes were murdered by mobs. In 1885, 164 Negroes were murdered by mobs. In 1886, 136 Negroes were murdered by mobs. In 1887, 128 Negroes were murdered by mobs. In 1888, 143 Negroes were murdered by mobs. In 1889, 127 Negroes were murdered by mobs. In 1890, 171 Negroes were murdered by mobs. In 1891, 192 Negroes were murdered by mobs. In 1892, which is the highest year on record, 241 Negroes were murdered by mobs. In 1893, 200 Negroes were murdered by mobs. In 1894, 190 Negroes were murdered by mobs. In 1895, 171 Negroes were murdered by mobs. In 1896, 131 Negroes were murdered by mobs. In 1897, 156 Negroes were murdered by mobs. In 1898, 127 Negroes were murdered by mobs. And in 1899, 107 Negroes were murdered by mobs. And those are not just men, those are men, women, and children. And that is at the hands of senseless mobs for simple accusations, often found to be innocent after their bodies have been mutilated and burned at the hands of this angry, bloodthirsty mob. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. Thanks for tuning in. Of these thousands of men and women who have been put to death without jury or judge, less than 1/3 of them have been ever even accused of criminal assault. The world at large has accepted unquestionably the statement that Negroes are lynched only for assaults upon white women. Of those who were lynched from 1882 to 1891, the first 10 years of the tabulated lynching record, the charges are as follows. 269 were charged with rape, 253 with murder, 44 with robbery, 37 with incendiarism or setting something on fire, 4 with burglary, 27 with race prejudice. So it's illegal and worthy of lynching to have race prejudice. 13 quarreled with white men. So you couldn't even have an argument with a white man. 10 making threats. 7 with rioting. 5 with miscegenation. In 32 cases, no reasons were given. The victims were lynched on general principles. During the past 5 years, the record is as follows. Of the 171 persons lynched in 1895, only 34 were charged with this crime. In 1896, out of the 131 persons who were lynched, only 34 were said to have assaulted women. Of the 156 in 1897 that were lynched, only 32. In 1898, out of 127 persons lynched, 24 were charged with the alleged usual crime. In 1899, of the 107 lynchings, 16 were said to be for crimes against women. These figures, of course, speak for themselves, and the unprejudiced, fair-minded person, it is only necessary to read and study them in order to show that the charge that the Negro is a moral outlaw is a false one, made for the purpose of injuring the Negro's good name and to create public sentiment against him. So even way back then, they villainized your Blackness and they weaponized your compassion. If public sentiment were alive, as it should be upon the subject, it would refuse to be longer hoodwinked, and the voice of conscience would refuse to be stilled by these false statements. If the laws of the country were obeyed and respected by the white men of the country who charged that the Negro has no respect for law, these things could not be. For every individual, no matter what charge, would have a fair trial and an opportunity to prove his guilt or innocence before a tribunal of law. That is all the Negro asks. That is all the friends of law and order need to ask. For once the law of the land is supreme, no individual who commits a crime will escape punishment. Individual Negroes commit crimes the same as white men, the same as do white men, but that the Negro race is peculiarly given to assault upon women is a falsehood of the deepest dye. The tables given above show that the Negro who is saucy to white men is lynched as well as the Negro who is charged with assault upon women. Less than 1/6 of the lynchings last year, 1899, were charged with rape. The Negro points to his record during the war in rebuttal of this false slander. When the white women and children of the South had no protector save only the Negroes, not one instance is known where that trust was betrayed. It is remarkably strange that the Negro had more respect for womanhood with the white men of the South of hundreds of miles away than they have today when surrounded by those who take their lives with impunity and burn and torture, even worse than the unspeakable Turk. Again, the white women of the North came south years ago, threaded the forest, visited the cabins, taught the schools, and associated only with the Negroes whom they came to teach, and had no protectors near at hand. They had no charge or complaint to make of the danger to themselves after association with this class of human beings. Not once has the country been shocked by such recitals from them as come from the women who are surrounded by their husbands, brothers, lovers, and friends. If the Negro's nature is bestial, it certainly should have proved itself in one of these two instances. The Negro asks only justice and an impartial consideration of these facts. Anthony McPhail says, in a town not far from where he lives in Colfax, Louisiana, on April 13th, 1873, they lynched as many as 153 Black men at the Colfax courthouse. That's ridiculous. And they continue these heinous acts to this very day. And they weaponize and vilify, they use the media as a weapon against Black people over and over and over again. And they make sure that they put the image of the big, Black, scary man that's violent and wanting to ravish white women and wanting to take over your household in the media. They continue to put that image out there and vilify us as demons and monsters. and they've been doing it for over 100 years. That is the end of mob rule in Louisiana. We finally got through it. I am accepting suggestions for our next book. I have a couple of things in mind. I put the link in the chat in case anyone wants to come up. But Ida B. Wells told the story as it was. These men were not assaulting white women. Lynching was supposed to be only for the case of sexual assault against white women. But lynching became the law of the land, and mob rule became the way in which they administered justice. They felt like they had the right to kill us with impunity. They felt that they had the right because they were frustrated. Any accusation was worthy of lynching, and they sought pleasure in the lynching. They actually enjoyed carving up our flesh and putting hot pokers to our skin and mutilating our bodies. This is why I really, with knowledge and understanding, don't think that that a mixed couple can make it, because if you operate according to knowledge, you would know that it's impossible to be with these people unless you are giving into some type of weird fetish. The forecast says Carter G. Woodson books or The Delectable Negro, but it gets weird at the end. Oh, I have The Delectable Negro, maybe that one. They enjoyed it, and it was also economic warfare. Absolutely, it was economic warfare, because when they killed business owners and people and community organizers and the postman that didn't want to give up his post. They killed people that were in places and positions of power. They felt like they could kill us with impunity. And for that reason, no one ever charged them with crimes. Thousands of people were at a lynching on average, and no one ever got accused with the crime of lynching or murder or killing, even when it was found that these people were innocent. So how much disregard for human life did they have? And the only way that they came out of that was when they found out that they weren't going to get the government funding that they were accustomed to getting because of all the lynchings and murder that was going on. So it was the quote unquote sensible white folks that said, listen, y'all can't continue to do this and get this government funding. All right. And Anthony McPhail suggests Black Anglo-Saxon by Dr. Julia Hare and Nathan, and by Doctors Julia and Nathan Hare. Black Anglo-Saxons. Let's see if I have that, or if I have access to that book. I might have to order that one. But, we have to operate with these people according to knowledge. And what we know is that they are brutal. They don't see us as human. They attack us in groups and in mobs. They only want to see if they can get any type of economic benefit out of us. If they can't get the economic benefit out of us, then they they don't see us as viable or valuable at all. They don't see us as worthy of having life. They don't see us as they went hunting down Black people and accused Black people of crimes based on the suspicion of the fact that the man wasn't at home, and he was lynched because he wasn't at home when a crime was committed, because they said a Negro did it and he was the only Negro that wasn't at home. So how unfair is that? How unrelenting are they in their mindset to think that just because someone wasn't at home, they deserve to be killed for a crime that they can't verify, what happened. The Black Anglo-Saxons is a book about Negroes with an identity crisis. That sounds interesting. I found it on archive.org, so yeah, we can read that book. Definitely read that one. That sounds like their justice system in courts today. That is exactly like their justice system in their courts of today. You're Black, whether you are driving while Black or congregating while Black or existing while Black, Blackness is a crime. And it has always been a crime in this country. And what they tend to do is they will make up crimes that you have committed just because you're Black. I have a friend right now that got tased in the eye because he was existing while Black in Virginia. He got tased in his eyeball. So now they didn't find anything on him. He wasn't being charged with the crime. He didn't fit the description of the person they were looking for. And now he has a lawsuit. But he got tased in the eye because he was existing while Black. All right, guys. I'm going to get out of here. Tonight was a short one. We just wrapped it up tonight. I appreciate you, AW Don 7, Anthony McPhail, and the forecast. I know that Raw is listening with the elders. I know that Brother Bakari is listening. I know that Oni is listening. I know that Koku is listening. I know that Dorico Cooper is listening. I know Tinkerbell 87 is listening. I know that the staff at Jesse's Kids and the staff at the Daycare Ladies Network are listening. I know that the staff at the Anthony Adrian Academy are listening, and so many others. And you, yes, even you. I thank each and every one of you for being here. We'll be back tomorrow with the Black Anglo-Saxons. Let's talk about this identity crisis that these people have. We're going to read chapters 1, 2, and 3 tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you all so much for being here. Peace, guys.